Number 4. Pastoral language and the secular problem of understanding. To understand the problem of a pastoral council, one must examine the problem of a pastoral language of the council. John Paul II, as a man of the council, speaks a pastoral language of the council, naturally in his own style and with a particular force of expression. Thus, to understand the documents of the council and the Pope's commentary on them, one must first examine their common language. The language dilemma awaited the Fathers unpretentiously at the entrance to the council. Here they could display ad limina their status as relevant and up-to-date. They stood before the alternative. Should the council speak in the traditional technical language of theology, and that was naturally the classical language of scholasticism, or in a new language which is more generally understandable? The Fathers promptly discarded the academic scholastic terminology, notwithstanding its preeminent usage in magisterial documents for centuries, and preferred the pastoral language of the council. Of course, it is possible to express the time-honored faith of the Church in a pastoral language, and thus to bring it closer to modern man. By adopting such pastoral language for an ecumenical council, however, Vatican II itself would have to take and pass a test, a truly historical precedent. Whether Vatican II passed the test fully or not is an open question. An objective study of the council documents will show that it succeeded remotely, and only remotely, in clothing the old truths unpretentiously in a new, dynamic, historically based biblical language, and in producing valuable results of theological workmanship. The language experiment, however, could only succeed because the vast majority of the Council Fathers stood on the firm ground of a well-defined traditional theology, and hence were capable of keeping the pastoral language under control. For the same reason, the more accurate interpretation of the council documents, as the majority of the Fathers intended, can be ascertained even today only on the basis of traditional doctrine and church teaching. One cannot deny, however, that the pastoral language is frequently used at the expense of dogmatic precision and clarity, that by a pastoral language the continuity with tradition can be easily blurred, and that, in the final analysis, one can only determine the exact meaning of the statements with the help of traditional notions. Further, one must admit that the incorporation of a theological notion in the, quote, Catholic system, John Henry Cardinal Newman, which was established by the painstaking efforts of theologians over the centuries and expounded through numerous magisterial decisions, becomes much more difficult. A theology and church faithful to tradition cannot do without the stability and continuity of clearly expressed ideas, much less an ecumenical council. Due to its teaching authority, it provides in its documents a theological foundation for the entire church. One might then ask whether the council documents, written in a pastoral language, which as such deviates from the Catholic system of church teaching, and whose continuity with tradition requires vindication by many of laborious and subtle distinctions, does not already sow the seeds of a break with tradition. Furthermore, one must agree that the scope of the accessibility and relevance of the pastoral language of the Council was confined to the Western Hemisphere, and that the intercultural aspect of the language problem was thus overlooked. The teaching of the Church, and hence the Council documents, must be understood in all languages and cultures. It is well known that precisely the language and conceptual clarity of St. Thomas is particularly well understood in the Far East and India, as opposed to the modern jargon. It may be asked whether the abandonment of the traditional language of the Church and theology, which had a universal character, did not pave the way for a pluralism of cultural theologies. Footnote: the most impressive example of the capability of receiving and further developing Occidental science and philosophy is Japan, which first opened itself to the West in 1868. Ultimately, we may raise the question, why did an ecumenical council, which wanted to lay down the theological basis for a church comprising then 700 million faithful, absolutely have to compose its extensive documents, which, moreover, for the most would only be studied by theologians, in a down-to-earth and relevant language, and thereby would leave the Church faced with the problem of whether to integrate the council texts into their dogmatic tradition or to abandon it completely. The latter would be a new beginning on unsteady ground. The pastoral language of the council was regarded as merely a pastoral question. In reality, it involved a completely different problem in a completely different dimension, namely, the secular problem of understanding in the framework of the modern view of history and outlook on life, which has occupied our Western mentality as a whole, and which has repeatedly plagued Catholic theology since the 19th century. This modern view, which the Church rejected in the form of modernism, urgently distresses today's theologians as a hermeneutical problem. The clarification of this angle, unsolved problem of the century, would have warranted a council. A pastoral council, however, would make light of such a problem. Through the abandonment by the Council Fathers of the scholastic language, the floodgates were practically, quasi-officially opened, virtually by tacit agreement, for a new theology, and that at a point in time when the language problem affected the whole of Catholic theology. The leading theologians naturally saw that the language would affect the nature, indeed the very substance, of the theology and the faith. For scholastic terminology was inseparable from scholastic philosophy and theology, and thus intimately bound up with the dogmatic tradition of the Church. The abandonment by the Council Fathers of the scholastic language entailed, in reality, the discarding of scholastic theology, and hence a divorce between the philosophia perennis and the faith after centuries of being united. That was exactly the aim of the leading theologians of the Council, although they themselves must have realized that the philosophia perennis meant the entire tradition of Western Christian philosophy. The Fathers' abandonment of scholastic language was for them the conditio sine qua non for the establishment of a break with the former dogmatic theology, in order to introduce the new theology after the dissolution and final surrender of the old. The men of the new theology were, for example, convinced that along with the completely outdated physics of the ancients, their metaphysics must be likewise outdated. Further, they maintained that modern theology wedded to ancient metaphysics is no longer based on reality, and moreover has lost all relevance in face of the modern view of history and outlook on life. Theology professors, who as students had easily understood the creeds of the old Church and the traditional dogmatic theology, found everything suddenly unintelligible. Footnote: a paradigm of this mentality is the lecture of Freiburg professor Bernhard Welte at the Salzburg University Seminar, July 23 to August 6, 1972, on the crisis of dogmatic statements on Christ. Welte began by saying that the definitive dogmatic statements on Jesus Christ, his divine and human nature, his substantial unity with the Father, as they were defined in the first four councils of late antiquity and handed down for more than 1,000 years with the same words as before, today have fallen into a serious crisis. Welte named two reasons. Through modern historical critical biblical science, exegesis, the fundamental discrepancy between biblical and late ancient Hellenistic thinking is made clear. Add to this that the modern mental framework can no longer grasp the main ideas of former times, such as essence and nature. These concepts today have lost their original sense. The very language of the ancient statements on Christ is no longer understood today. The concept of essence is in fact the overall main idea by which, in the form of Jesus, the relation of the Son to the Father is expressed as an abstract formula. We had to recognize, however, the relative character of such formulas, which depend on circumstances. They are products of Alexandrian philosophy of the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ and conform to a formally prevailing direction of inquiry. The concept of event can be viewed as the leading concept of the biblical understanding of Jesus, which likewise reflects the modern mental framework. We are witnessing a historically decisive transformation which happened in late antiquity and seems to be happening again in our day. On the question of whether in such cases the link with tradition be broken, Welter answered, quote, "In the form of expression, yes. In the essentials of the faith, no." End quote. Der katholische Gedanke, Regensburg, 28th year of issue, volume 28, 1972, page 136, end footnote. The extremity of the break with tradition is made clear by the dictum of a highly reputable professor of dogmatic theology, who from his chair counseled his students to burn their obsolete preconciliar manuals in good conscience. In this unprecedented semantic revolution and historically decisive transformation, the entire traditional dogmatic theology was easily swept away. After clearing the foundation, the structure of a new theology could be continued uninterrupted at the wayside of the pastoral language of the Council. For the promoters of the new theology, the watchword aggiornamento meant the definitive opening of the Church to modern thought in order to construct a completely different theology, from which the birth of a novel, relevant Church was to follow. Footnote: how such a new Church from below, from the Christian Marxist spirit, looks in the end, see Leonardo Boff, Ecclesiogenesis, Petropolis, 1977. End footnote. Never before in the history of the Church has an ecumenical council taken a stand on a question which concerned the foundation of the entire dogmatic tradition of the Church, as Vatican II has done. Never before was a papal encyclical allowed, after a mere 15 years, to be so rapidly and so completely disavowed by the very people whom it condemned, as Humani Generis, 1950, in which Pius XII defended the Philosophia Perennis, demanded adherence to the dogmatic language of the Church, and warned against the surrender of the Catholic faith to the philosophical notions marked by the spirit of the times. With great clarity, Pius XII analyzed the intellectual situation before the Council and pointed out the dangers of a new theology. Quote, "While they despise this philosophy, they extol others, whether ancient or modern, whether of the peoples of the Orient or of the Occident, so that they seem to insinuate that any philosophy or belief, with certain additions, if need be, as corrections or supplements, can be reconciled with Catholic dogma. No Catholic can doubt that this is quite false, especially since it involves those fictions which they call immanence, or idealism, or materialism, whether historic or dialectic, or even existentialism, whether professing atheism, or at least rejecting the value of metaphysical reasoning." End quote. Exponents of the new theology were made cardinals, a public rehabilitation. The outward appearance of the new theology is multifaceted, but basically quite simple, so one can summarize the various forms under the same name. The rejection of traditional theology is common to all the forms. That means the dismissal of the Catholic system of John Henry Cardinal Newman, which is promptly replaced by the most varied new attempts of the individual theologians. Thereby arose the modern pluralism of theologies in the Catholic Church. The general guiding principle of the new theology is the attractively simple idea: a new theology in the domain of the scientific method and the modern view of history and outlook on life. The new theology means an entirely new beginning for the Catholic Church, a, quote, historically decisive transformation, end quote, Bernhard Welte. That idea was, however, by no means new. It only picked up on what scholastic theology and the magisterium, in its struggle against modernism, had successfully hindered, but which had for a long time already proved to be a character trait of Protestant theology. Revelation and faith were adapted to the philosophical intellectual movements of the times, that is, practically abandoned. One could not create the, quote, modern view of history and outlook on life. It was already there. One only had to adopt it. It comprised broadly the very systems which Pius XII had rejected as untenable in Humani Generis: immanentism, existentialism, idealism, and historical and dialectical materialism. From the choice of that kind of system resulted, on a wider scale, the attack of the new theology on the traditional theology of the Church, decried as dismembered, with its supposedly unrealistic dualism. Its only position was thus an open or hidden monism in which the supernatural order became fused with the natural, resulting in a sublime unity no longer to be cut asunder. Existential idealism denied objective metaphysics and incorporated each real object, including the objective truth of revelation, into the vast universe of its subjectivity and historical relevance. In the wake of the Frankfurt neo-Marxist school, such a political theology was able to evolve in favor of the following subversive tenets. There is only one reality, namely the historical. The radical distinctions in traditional theology of transcendence and immanence, nature and grace, church and world, salvation history and world history, the present life and the life to come, time and eternity, creation and redemption, profane and sacred, natural and supernatural revelation, are dismissed as inadmissible dualism and hallucinations. The faith of the Church dissolves into pure history. The result of the new theological principle is the pluralism of countless theologies, which, through enculturated theologies of every culture and religion, are constantly multiplying. The encyclical Humani Generis is forgotten or ignored. Nothing demonstrates the complete abandonment of the Catholic system of John Henry Cardinal Newman more clearly than the complicated pluralism in current theology. A significant product of this development is the series of publications of a missionary society entitled The Myth of Christian Uniqueness Toward a Pluralistic Theology of Religions. It sounds like a theological echo of Assisi when it says, quote, "A new Christian theology of religions is taking shape, moving beyond the traditional models of exclusivism that says Christianity is the only true religion, and inclusivism, Christianity is the best religion, and toward a new pluralistic view that recognizes the possibility of many religious paths, all of them valid. A widely divergent group of Christian theologians, Protestant and Catholic, female and male, East and West, First and Third World, explore genuinely new attitudes toward other religious believers and traditions." End quote. The Second Vatican Council should be viewed in the context of this development in theology and in the Church. In this context, the problem of a pastoral council becomes apparent. Likewise, the problem of abandoning defined articles of faith for the sake of pastoral language. In this context, we may restate the question critically. Did the council really succeed in presenting intact and with unmistakable clarity the immutable teaching of the Church in pastoral language, or could the new theology have infiltrated the council documents?